we think that it's time for a public bank of New Mexico. We have our Alliance for Local Economic Prosperity, which includes a great team of people who've been working on this for about anywhere between 8 and 10 years. Good morning, Clifton. Clifton is one of our team members. Here comes Sarah.
Hi there. Wow.
Sorry about all the hassle. Let me just review what our purpose is, and then if you're ready to jump in, you can do so.
Sure.
We want to enhance our economic, social, and cultural health and well-being of New Mexico communities, and we think that in order to do that, that we need to keep more of our New Mexico revenue safe, local, and working for New Mexicans. And one way to do that is to create a state public bank. And Sarah, I'll turn it over to you now that you've
Great.
It out.
Public banking is actually, we are part of a wider movement that is sort of spontaneously happening across the country as we are understanding the limits of globalization in terms of how we use our resources. And so states across the country are looking at keeping their state funds home rather than invested in Wall Street when they don't actually need it for spending at home. And so this is across the state, people are looking at, in California, they would be city banks, not the city bank, but banks for cities. There will be state banks, and there's also a movement on the national level to do a national infrastructure bank. So this is not a new thing. It's been around for a very long time, since 1919 in the state of North Dakota, which has been amazingly successful at stabilizing that state's economy and giving it the agility to solve problems. Thank you. Next.
Oh, great. Now I'm going to freeze. Here we go.
Okay. Great. So one of the reasons why we think it's a very important move to create a public bank for New Mexico now is that in approximately the end of 2023, the fire hose of federal money that's been coming into our state will be turned down and then may well be turned off. So this is the appropriate time for us when we do have very strong revenues from oil and gas, to be blunt. It's time to take some of that money and redirect it towards investing in our people, our businesses, and our communities.
So we think that it's time to we have a sweet spot operating now. If we create a bank within legislation in this session, in this coming session later this month, we can have a public bank up and running by the middle of 2023. And we see that as a time when that change in end of recovery funds and also increasing need for the economic development funds that will support their recently issued plan will be available and begin to add lending power to the state's finance system. There's currently a strong overlapping mission between education, the Economic Development Department, and New Mexico Finance Authority, and what they are doing and how they're doing it. But what's not there is the means to more fully expand that funding capacity without direct appropriations. And as noted here in our last bullet, the opening deposit of a $50 million investment through an appropriation to actually provide capital for the bank can actually turn into $400 to $500 million in lending capacity, which would be a major investment for the state to make. I want to point to two especially important, I think, events and opportunities that we have where the bank can especially be strengthening the finance system of the state and supporting programs. Economic Development Department in October issued a 20-year plan for New Mexico called Empower and Collaborate. And with the goal of building a diverse and robust economy that engages local talent, cultivates innovation, and delivers prosperity for all New Mexicans. And what we see that's inhibiting that potential is there is some lack of collaboration currently, and it's pointed out in the report, through economic development stakeholders. And also there are a number of communities and a number of groups of people who are not getting access to the current lending capacity that we have. There's also going to be a pinch on the financial system. The Federal Reserve has already noted that they're going to be increasing interest rates during 2022. They're not obviously going to escalate in a big way, but it's going to make a difference for borrowers. So what we want to note is that the bank will be profitable by the second year. It will, with the moderately conservative pro forma that we've developed with a UNM Anderson School of Management finance professor and leaders from credit unions and also investment people. We have run financial figures that show that the bank can be profitable in the second year. It can assume more risk and still be profitable. And by the end of 7 years, at no cost to the state, the public bank's capital will increase from 50 to 113, almost 113 million. That 113 million in capital will make possible almost $1 billion in lending capacity for supporting economic development and infrastructure projects in our community. And I'd like to share with you just this slide, which also shows that in the 7-year annual equity growth rate would be 12.4%, and that's with assuming additional risk above and beyond what we normally would see community banks and credit unions taking on.
So the next question that everybody is asking is, okay, how does this work? And if you'll go to the next slide, Angela, thank you. This is just a quick schematic that shows basically how the bank will work. The loans developed for lending with community, credit unions, community development people, CDFIs, and banks working in local communities. Those loans need to be created by us, by the people, based on our understanding of local needs. And one of the things that we are doing at AFLEP is holding what we're calling community conversations, which is an effort to get people to tell us in their own words what's best about their communities, what they want changed in their communities, and what would be a huge thing that they can think of that would really improve prosperity in New Mexico, because that's what we're going for. So the needs will be explained going up through a variety of routes to get to the board of directors, and that who will set policy but not create the loan programs for the bank. So if we go to the next page, Angela, I want to talk a little bit about the nitty-gritty Thank you. How the bank would work. So we want to identify needs, and then the public bank would develop loan programs that they think will benefit people across the state. So, for example, we've heard from many communities that local transportation, buses, very unsexy, but they're really needed to help cut down on the need for a car and the use of cars. But that is an area that the state, for a variety of very good reasons, isn't really paying attention to. But when we hear that in 3 different locations across the state, we know that that is a need that people just want to have solved. So perhaps a program could be developed to encourage and to help fund startup bus systems, which are usually private. So the bank would create the loan program. We would partner with credit unions and CDFIs, community banks, to have those programs available for people who need to start up money or get this thing off the ground, do studies to see if it's actually viable. So the borrower would go to the local community bank or credit union, which would in turn go to the public bank, and the loan process would begin. So what this also does is it increases the capacity of our local financial institutions to stay alive and to be profitable in their own communities. All of these things together will create jobs. And so the communities would get jobs, businesses would start up, GRT taxes on a local level will increase, and that will help with local community all across the board. So the significant features of the public bank then, next slide, please. Okay, is that the board tries to be an organization that does reach across the state. So its board members would be, first of all, the secretary of the Economic Development Committee, the state treasurer, and the CEO of the New Mexico Finance Authority. There would also be 4 individuals with banking investment backgrounds. We want really top-notch people, and 4 individuals on the board with extensive community development and finance experience. Management would be separate from the board, and we want experienced bankers there with civic service and community outlook. So we want people with a strong sense of the public good to be part of the management and of the board of the bank. What this will do is give more flexibility for what is traditionally talked about as risk. But risk in banking terms really means, well, we don't know you and you don't have a track record. And sometimes creating a loan program is way expensive when it's a small loan because there's not enough money in it for the bank. So they tend not to do that. But with the additional money and backing of the public bank, the state bank, they would be able to do that. And so the risk would be shared. Incidentally, when we're talking about risk, you also need to know that if no one wants to borrow a thing, then the money, all $50 million of it, goes right back to the state. So there's no risk to the population. And of course, there would be full regulatory oversight by all of the people who do that across the country. This is a real bank. It is not just a diversion area for whatever people are scared of. But we would meet federal requirements. We would have access to the Federal Reserve and the state and the FDIC. That's a brief look. Angela?
Thank you, Sarah. As Sarah noted in that last point here, if there's no lending demand, those funds will revert back to the state with no losses. We have the other assurance that we have, the bank would be the programs and the lending would be based on principles of equity and democratic board governance. we believe that these values are key components and a part of what can be different and make an influence on the state's lending system. And this is something that once the legislation is passed, that the AFLEP team is committed to following through to influence how policy is developed, who's selected to be management of the bank, and how the board members are selected. So we've built in some of those points within the legislation itself, and also intend to, in very similar way, if you're familiar with the Health Security Act team, they have been very strong advocates and supporters and have continued to stay engaged as each step of the way. And that's the intention here. We don't just walk away once the legislation is passed. We stay engaged as much as we can and influence how this actually is developed and evolves. I want to honor our time here and ask if you might have questions or comments about this. But the last thing I do want to say is we definitely think that the time is right now for the bank, that we know we have this fire hose of funds coming in now to appropriate in this next session, but we also have to be looking ahead at what's our situation going to be in the next 3 to 5 years, and how are we positioning for that. And so we don't deal just with what's on our nose, but be looking ahead to what can be there to help us with continuing to be strong, resilient, and keep these economic development goals in mind for as we go into the future.
Thank you all for joining us. Oh, Laura, you have a question.
Yes, I'm sorry I missed the first portion of it, but something that came to mind during your presentation, because I have a feeling most of this is going to be discussed at the legislature, right? This will be pretty much your presentation. So you may have already spoken about how this is different from NMFA, but I think the impact on local banks is an important part of the conversation, because the smaller banks may have a different interpretation of what is going to be happening versus what is the plan. And then collateral, for those that are in the finance committee, that's going to be a very important subject matter that I'm sure will be on the FIR. As far as transportation as your example, I think for any legislator, that's a really difficult one, because when we think about transportation, we always think of it in the red, because we know that public transportation is never for making money. You will always lose money. And when I first started, I was working with Mr. Cog and Lawrence Royale. He was the executive director at the time. And that was a big argument that people made, is that the rail runner always loses money. And then we had to explain nationally, all public transportation loses money. The point is not ever to make money off of it, but to provide for service. So if you're thinking of an example of how somebody can attain some type of income and job security, I don't know if public transportation is the way to go, because in the back of a lot of people's minds, that just shows red, at least in mine. And then how your numbers were calculated for your annual growth, and if those include or subtract the 50 million that you started out with.
They include, because we're building on it. I'll answer that, and then we need to close. I appreciate the points that you're raising. It includes the 50 million is there, and it's how it generates additional credit and continues to grow. So it does include that.
Okay, those are just a couple of the things for feedback for when you're working on your presentation. I mean, I know I pretty much know the answers, but just a thought for our legislators. Thank you, ladies, for everything you guys are doing.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Laura. And also, just to make a note, that the state bank is in the state platform also. So we wanted to highlight that. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for all the work
I
you all are doing.